session on fostering resilience and trauma-responsive skills. So the first test was finding our room location, so you all passed. Excellent job. So the way we are going to run this session today is we are going to spend a couple of minutes up here, about 20 minutes or so, giving you all some background information on the topic of resilience and trauma-responsive skills. And then we're going to spend the remaining 30 minutes together in breakout sessions. So you'll have some options on which section you want to go to. Okay. So just to introduce myself quickly, I'm Melissa Pori. I am the Account Management Director for Staff Care and Resilience with the KonTerra Group, and I'm also a licensed professional counselor. And I am joined today by my colleague, Dr. Tim Calvey. Tim, if your microphone works, do you want to introduce yourself briefly? Okay, Tim will introduce himself in a couple minutes. We are also joined by our partners, Siddharth and Carla from Greenleaf over here, and they will introduce themselves shortly as well. So just to give you a quick overview of the KonTerra Group, and Greenleaf will do the same in a little bit. We are a consulting group who offers mental health, wellness, and evaluation services in the humanitarian and international development sectors. So we do this by providing short-term, solutions-focused counseling, customized training on topics similar to what we're going to be talking about today together. So things like stress and resilience, managing trauma, coping in crisis situations, and similar kinds of topics. We also offer facilitated conversations around really tough things, manager and leadership support, and we do this all while aiming to build resilience at the individual, team, and organizational level. One thing that's important about KonTerra is that our clinicians and experts all live and work in the same locations where the clients we work with exist and function. So everything that we're going to talk about today is through the lens of having had this lived experience of being on the ground and experiencing some of the same things that our clients are navigating, those really tough topics, those really hard conversations. We've been through it ourselves as well. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what's happening in the sector through that lived experience lens and what it means to be resilient. I'm going to turn it over to Tim to take us through this.
Can you hear me okay?
No. Here, why don't you take this one?
Good. Oh, hi. Ooh, now you can hear me. Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Tim Calvey. It is an honor to be with all of you here today. I'm the Senior Consulting Psychologist with the KonTerra Group. So obviously, why are we focusing today on the topic of resilience? And I think the title of the conference says it all, A World in Crisis. And certainly in my work at KonTerra, I spend every day talking to leaders, HR, security professionals, often when it relates to a critical incident and how should they be supporting and thinking about creating a culture of care, particularly during a crisis. And so over the last few years, I've had the opportunity to talk to hundreds. And the trends that I am hearing and seeing across the sector are one, and I think all of you may experience this as well in your organizations, is an increase in divisiveness. That there's so much in the world that is dividing us, whether it's political ideologies, whether it's staffing concerns, staff and leaders having tensions, home offices, headquarters having tensions. And so leaders are really wondering, what do we do? How do we create a safe environment so people can dialogue together? And so that's kind of the big theme I hear. The second theme is just, if you think back since 2020, the number of critical incidents on a global scale that we have been monitoring and supporting, starting with the pandemic. So many wars, so many civil conflicts, protests, the pandemic itself, natural disasters, evacuation, so just one after another, and people are feeling the fatigue of handling so much crisis. And so obviously a really important trend as we're talking about a world in crisis. The third trend that I hear so much is just how much people are dealing with little resources, funding cuts, staffing cuts. Many of our staff are holding many different roles, and so that's leading to lots of burnout. And so these are the trends I'm hearing. I'm just curious, if you think about the work that you do at your organizations, what are some trends you're hearing about why resilience is important to talk about? Yes, hi. Hey. Burnout, yes, huge topic, and it's real. So important topics. Hopefully we'll continue to dialogue about that in our breakout sessions. So obviously we want to start with, what is it to be resilient? I remember years ago we talked about resilience all the time, and all of a sudden it just became so common, people kind of got unsure of what it actually meant. I saw a commercial for shampoo that told me I'd have more resilient hair. So obviously we have to keep thinking about, what do we mean when we say we want to create and foster resilience? Yesterday I had the opportunity to provide a workshop for 30 staff members who work primarily in democracy and governance. And one of the participants in the workshop said to me, when I think about resilience, it's facing down reality. It's accepting the challenge and figuring out how to adapt and how to pivot. And I thought that was a brilliant definition of resilience. And so rather than enduring the challenge and the stress that we face, we have to figure out, what do we need to do proactively to transform ourselves, to take time to learn about, how did we face the challenges of yesterday? How did I grow? What new strength did I discover in myself or my team? And how do I use that to transform myself for the next inevitable challenge? So it's about transformation rather than endurance.
So one of the things we want to call your attention to this morning is those factors that help us to start to build resilience. This is something that we can actually pay attention to, that we can actually do work on, that we can actually build over time. So if you look up here at the list of 10 resilience building factors, do any of these feel surprising? Is anybody wondering what some of these things are? Probably not, right? You've heard about good sleep. You've heard about exercise. We know nutrition is important. But how often do we actually take the time to pay attention to what's going on for us in our lives and what we need and what we need to prioritize? And sometimes that doesn't feel easy, because it means we have to let go of something else that feels like a priority. I've got my family, I've got my work, I've got people in crisis situations that I'm responsible for. How am I going to turn that off and get relaxation and enjoyment? That doesn't feel okay. Right. But we know from experience, we know from research, that it's important for us to pay attention to these things. Because the more we pay attention to these things, the easier it becomes over time for us to continue to navigate through the really tough stuff. So if you think about yourselves and consider these 10 resilience factors, I'm just going to ask you a question. How many of you think, yeah, I do pay attention to this stuff on a regular basis. This is really important to me. And I think nearly every day I cover at least some of these resilience factors. Show of hands, how many people feel that way? Yeah, don't be shy. Excellent. And you're all the people I'm going to learn from, so we're going to talk after this, because that's hard to do, right? How many of you people out there are thinking, you know, this is important, and I know that, but I can't always do these things? Do it sometimes, but I can't always do it, yeah? How many people are going, well, once in a while, I might order a salad at lunch. I might get some extra sleep, and that feels really good, but it's really not as often as I should, and I know that. How many of you are out there? See a couple. And where are my people who are like, exercise? Never met her. I don't know what you're talking about. These things seem really important. And how? How do we fit these things in? How will I ever have a positive outlook when things are so dire, so overwhelming? Anyone feel that way? It's okay if you do. It's pretty common. And just by show of hands, how many people have thought to themselves, whether recently or within the past couple months, these are some things I just really have to keep focusing on? I'm feeling pretty stressed. And these are things that I need to note, I need to pay attention to. Yeah. So even though there are only 10 factors, it's still a lot to hold on to. When we're trying to navigate so many things, when we're juggling so many tough things on a daily basis, even 10 things can feel overwhelming. And so what we've done is categorize them into categories of resilience, as you can see on the screen here, to make it easier for you to think about what are the buckets of resilience? What are the categories of coping that I want to pay attention to in my everyday? And it's individual for each of you. The roadmap to resilience is different for each of us. And the part of the reason I wanted to ask you about where you're feeling in terms of these resilience factors today is because we have to note what works for us, where we are in each moment, and that's the only way that we will know where to go from there, okay? So in our breakout session, if you choose to come to the breakout on resilience, we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into each of these categories of resilience and kind of talk about where each of us is in this moment today, okay? All right, if you want to grab some resources to take with you, there are some on the table in front of you, and there's also a QR code here if you'd like to capture that before you head out. And we'll have some more resources for you to hand to you on the way out if you are interested as well. But for the sake of time, I'm going to pass it over to our partners, Siddharth and Carla.
Thank you, Melissa. Melissa and Tim, sparks of hope, campfires of hope, in fact, you are. Hello, everybody. I'm going to speak a little bit about trauma-responsive leadership, and I want to thank SID-US for amplifying this, not only having every learning lab circling around these themes, but also inviting us to speak about why trauma and how does it matter in the development sector. My colleague Carla is going to be leading any people who join our breakout. She and I are both clinicians with years of experience in service-oriented organizations and have looked at how trauma impacts the workforces, the support staff, and also how they respond to change and implementation of change when it comes to the policies, practices, and processes that would impact the degree of trauma that is felt by workforces. In order to anchor ourselves, helps to have a common definition of what is trauma. So what makes up trauma? A distressing experience or set of events that in some way change the way our neurobiology works. So it's experience changing the way our nervous system works. And to dive down a little deeper on that, it involves stress reactions to fear, threat, terror, and or injury. Again, by definition, it changes the way our brain works. There's a pathology, histopathology to how trauma and experience have affected brain tissue and the nervous system. Finally, and importantly, what we notice externally is that it modifies perception, thinking, and emotional reactions. So then why not let this be simply a personal matter instead of an organizational matter or a professional matter? It's because trauma is a system-wide issue. One cannot be in a fully recovery environment if the system is continually causing us hits of extreme stress that we have to cope with. And so the environment is critical, as well as our own personal practices. There's a shared responsibility of individuals and of systems, teams, and organizations to maintain the highest level of well-being as opposed to trauma. Secondly, to be trauma responsive is something that USAID and many in the sector, implementing partners, international NGOs, are recognizing as being one of the key barriers to performance of workforces and a key barrier to the programs and the outcomes that we wish for in our programs with program populations. I want to begin with these snapshots in time to ground us a little further about the milieu in which trauma exists. This milieu is outward, it's in the field, it's with the populations we're working with, but we are not separate from that completely. And so I think you'll see, as I lead along here, in the past, historical traumas, the narratives of winners and losers, victims and victimizers, these are psychological stories that are passed on generation to generation, and they accumulate into the present. Without a recovery environment, without attention to the trauma and how it impacts people's perceptions, their behaviors, you have the past living in the present. And in the words, for this quote here, in the words of a former Office of Transition Initiatives practitioner, today's traumas are the roots of tomorrow's conflicts. So whatever we don't deal with now is going to be something that we're going to be dealing with probably in a magnified fashion later. In the present, any ongoing deprivation, injuries, sense of conflict, all of these continue to be nervous system injuries that are held onto unless, again, one has a recovery environment. Finally, in the future, this is one that sometimes you have to wrap your head around a little bit more. But anytime we're in an insecure environment, as somebody on a program staff, in an insecure, non-permissive environment working, there is a part of our mind that's always thinking about, how do I not get hurt, or how do I make sure that my colleague doesn't get hurt? Every security procedure is a reminder that if I don't comply, or if there might be harm. So there, then again, is a reminder of mortality, the possibility of injury, the possibility of something going horribly wrong. For people who have an environment as a community, again, there's an ongoing sense of threat and harm that must be counteracted through vigilance. So how does this now translate into the development professional, us here in the room, potentially? These are the domains, just to simplify the domains in which it shows up in our lives. Managing threats, meaning the things that could happen, again, future. Vicarious trauma and secondary trauma, suggesting that anybody that we're in touch with that has traumatic symptoms, traumatic experiences, we can be affected vicariously through empathy. And sometimes one doesn't even have to talk to a traumatized person. There's a whole body language that then gets transmitted to us, quite through just sight. Finally, primary trauma is the domain of critical incidents, when something has actually happened to us that could have hurt us grievously. And near misses are included there because, as we probably all know, if you've ever had a near miss, it's not emotionally neutral. So there isn't a whole lot of representative data that's publicly available for this development sector. We at Greenleaf did a study that allowed us great access to field staff. I myself went to Pakistan, Afghanistan, Jordan. Other researchers went to other sites to do key informant interviews, focus groups with USAID staff, including Foreign Service nationals, locally engaged staff. And I want to just give you a tour through the findings and the so what of it. This is a heat map, meaning that blue represents numbers below 20%, yellow is between 20 and 49%, and then anything over 50% is red in this heat map. So imagine just for a moment that everybody on this side of the room actively, because of their work, believe that any of these could happen in the course of doing their work. I felt there was a risk of being caught in an armed conflict, held hostage, sexual assault. Just imagine the burden of thinking that this is what could happen to me at work. In the middle column, take about, conservatively, these two tables. 4 out of 10 people know somebody for whom any of those happened, right? So you're subject to secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma. Finally, in this column, even if this were 1%, if any of these were 1%, that's 1% too much, right? But so all of this, these are actually happened to a development professional. And so think about people who are doing democracy, rights, and governance, human rights defenders. All of them have these exposures. People working in conflict stabilization, all of them have these exposures. But I would also suggest that you don't have to be in the most extreme, potentially violent circumstances to have any of these, actually. Think of all the security trainings that one does to go into an environment which people wouldn't necessarily identify as a conflict zone. So we want to spark hope, right? And by sparking hope for us is to operationalize well-being. It's one thing to say we want well-being. It's another thing to actually say, how does it actually happen? What are the active ingredients to well-being? What has to be working together? What are the policies, practices, and processes? How do people among themselves reinforce a recovery environment as opposed to an environment that compounds and accentuates trauma? So some of the ways, this is just a representative way that we might think, a team may be able to use role-specific training, job aids. They may want to learn how to facilitate trauma-responsive conversations among themselves as a team. Many people, non-clinicians, very routinely will say, I don't want to do more harm than good. So what are the elements of trauma-responsive facilitation? We can certainly talk about that, and it can be learned. And one does not need to be turning into a neuroscientist or a clinician in order to do those well. What is one of the major goals of all of this? Why train? Why get consulting? Why use job aids? It's to develop more self-efficacy so that teams and individuals within these organizations can actually have the felt sense that I can do this, right? It's once been quipped that, I mean, if self-help books worked just by themselves, there would only need to be one self-help book in the world. Why do we keep writing them? Because people, of course, need different angles of attack in a self-help manner, but it's also because we have difficulty operationalizing the things we read and we say, those are good ideas. Those are really good ideas. So how do we operationalize it? Well, we got to socialize it in our teams and groups. It has to be socially acceptable. It has to be considered a work duty, a job description. So just to end on the note that we believe that in order to be trauma responsive in an organization, we'll do best to be methodical and intentional. And so these are 5 commitments in order to be methodical and intentional, to cover all the bases where trauma could be lurking if one does not pay attention. And so this is already on their table. It's also something that we'll do in the breakout if you want to do a deeper dive on one of these commitments. But ultimately, again, what we're looking for is to develop self-efficacy, the ability to be sparks of hope for each other with knowledge and with conviction. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Siddharth. We are going to move into our breakout sessions now, and we are going to have the folks doing the workshop on resilience are going to go up to the far left over here, and those of you who want to do the trauma leadership skills workshop can come to this side of the room. All of the materials for that workshop are already on the table, and we can move materials from over there to here. So once we settle down, we'll go ahead and give instructions on what the workshops will consist. So you may move to your choice location, and we will get started. Thank you.